on this issue. So we really appreciate that. It's my responsibility to move us forward into the last two sessions of the day, which are going to be really excellent sessions. I've been looking forward to them. We're sort of scanning the globe a little bit here, spanning the globe a little bit with the panel and speakers all the way from California to the Netherlands and the UK, and getting some of the greatest cybersecurity experts in the world together to do this panel. And one of them is the moderator for this panel, Sam Curry, who is now the CTO at Cybereason, but many of you know him from all of his different roles at different organizations and his participation in the cybersecurity community. So Sam, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ari. And thanks to everyone and my fellow panelists. It's a great group. I have to say, it's one of the best collections of people I've yet had a chance to do a panel with, I think. Of course, it's a tall order for us to go through all the cool stuff happening in cybersecurity at the moment and important stuff. So I do want to emphasize our goal is partly to make some of these topics exciting and to highlight things and maybe give you some new perspectives on maybe some old topics, some new topics, and what's cutting edge. There's 5 big areas we're going to try to cover. So 4 people, 1 moderator, and 5 subjects, and there's a 6th category. So the 5 areas, and I'll mention them because I think what will really start to be cool is if people start to riff off of these and in their answers, think about how to answer maybe multiple questions as well. The first is on process automation, the good side of it, the bad side, the ugly side. The second is vulnerability disclosure. It's funny, I was talking to some colleagues earlier today and they said, why are we still talking about this? How is this a possibility that we haven't done this yet? At least not to the satisfaction we would have hoped, I think 20 years ago or 25 years ago. Diversity and security. We talk about a big gap in security, an enormous mind the gap kind of problem. And it seems to be widening for all that we're producing new cybersecurity talent. What are we perhaps not doing right there is how Wendy put it in an email to me. The encryption fight. I mean, we've talked about encryption and let's say safety versus liberty, to paraphrase Ben Franklin, for years. It seems to not go away and keep cropping back up. So we'll talk about that. Election security. Here in the US, we just had a big one. It's not just the straight hacking of voting rolls and voter machinery. It's also the whole ecosystem around it, and now this notion of echo chambers. So we'll talk about that. And then the final +1 is crystal balls, which is us pontificating on trends and where we think things are going. So I think without any further ado, let's make this fun and interesting, folks. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, I'll try to do it alphabetically by last name and not mess that up. I'll call on each of you. If you could say a little bit about yourself and what you do. I will go as C. So after you, Jaya, I'll introduce myself as well. So Jaya Baloo, can you maybe introduce yourself to the audience a little bit?
Yes, hi, my name is Jaya Baloo. Thank you for inviting me. I feel really honored to be with this group. You too, Sam. And so I'm the CISO of Avast, and before that I was the Chief Information Security Officer at KPN and have been working on all of these issues for a while.
Great, thanks for joining us. My name is Sam Curry. I've been knocking around security for far too long, almost 30 years now to my horror. I am the Chief Security Officer for Cybereason, and I'm a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute, and I'm looking forward to having fun with all of you. So if I've done the alphabetical right, Suzette, I think you're next, right? Suzette Kent.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, I'm Suzette Kent. I was recently former federal CIO, so things in this space are of utmost priority. I spent my career both in banking and large-scale consulting around the world. And now that I'm no longer in the government, I'm actually working with universities and companies on the way that we build the technical workforce of the future. That gets to some of the questions that Sam's going to talk about today, and I'm honored to be here with this panel.
Great, thanks for being here. Ian, from across the pond, I think, if I'm right there. Ian Levy.
Thanks, Sam. Ian Levy, I'm the Technical Director for the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. So we're responsible for making sure the UK is the safest place to live and work online. And I assume that my speakers people at the NCSC misread the thing and thought it was the Cyberloonies panel, and that's why I'm here.
It might be. It might be in the end, by the way. Yeah. Certainly speaking for myself. And last but far from least, Wendy with the coolest hat of any of us now and most times. Wendy, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Thank you. Wendy Nather. I'm wearing this hat to cover up my pandemic hair. And I would just like to say to Ian Levy, if you ever form a monster raving cyber party, I would be one of the first ones to sign up for it. I used to work as a CISO for a Swiss bank and for state government. I spent 5 years as an industry analyst and also helped to stand up the retail and hospitality ISAC. And now I lead the advisory CISO team at Duo Security, which is now part of Cisco.
Excellent. So I think we have to have that party the next time we're out of quarantine and doing one of these CyberNextDC events. So let's mark that on the calendar and beg Ari for it. So let's start with you, Jaya. Perhaps maybe we'll talk about the encryption fight. And honestly, I could have asked any of you any of these questions. So anyone should feel free to chime in once Jaya has said something. But we've been talking everything from Clipper chips back in the day and trusted third parties for decades. Do you see the argument tipping one way or the other today? We see a lot of discussion about governments in various parts of the world, Australia, Europe, for instance, as two most recent ones, looking at this issue and having the right to read, or do we have a right to confidentiality? Have you seen this debate change from your perspective? And do you see it heading one way or the other?
I feel like we're on a sort of soap opera, where you have the evil twin every couple of times and then they come back and they're dead, but no, we had a brain transplant. So, and I feel like it's also an age test, I'm a child of the 70s. So like, I remember the 90s debate. My first job was dealing with export crypto so that you could have access to, well, I don't need to, the point is that I feel like we keep going in these cycles where we keep trying to figure out what the heck is an exceptional access request and what actually warrants this? And why can't we do it with just tailored access operations? So why would we need to break everything for everyone or potentially compromise something that was engineered in the very beginning of an innovation cycle in order to grant access to law enforcement? And isn't there another way? So we have these questions that reoccur significantly. And by the way, Ian, I read the lawfare stuff that you originally did. I just want to say props, dude, because that was excellent on the principles. But I think we need to talk about the whole Ghost protocol thing, because I really think the principles, this is spot on how we should be examining the issue. But when it comes down to the implementation, I really think we need to be excessively cautious in favor of protecting the majority. And this is something that is not always done when we try to look for what would actually constitute this. So when I was working in lawful interception, it was in order to allow access for countries within Europe to be part of the European community. And it was very simple. Lawful interception meant that everything that was on the wire, and now in some European countries, it's also everything that's off the wire, but cable related and non-cable related access all gets underneath an official request given to authorities. That's fine. If it's encrypted, it's a challenge for the authorities. So you give what you had and that was it. And you were never asked to do anything more than that, than work together to give everything that was possible. But you were never asked to re-engineer your core network in order to grant something that you had never applied in the first place. And I think these are the places where I'm really concerned about some of the things that are happening in Europe, specifically now, as early as a week ago, around communications access to WhatsApp, for example. So I really think we need to come together as a community to figure out better solutions.
Thank you for that. By the way, I do want to encourage the audience. If you have questions, do feel free to put them in the chat. I will try to inject them into the questions. But Ian, Jaya just gave you mad props. So I have to come to you and say, this has to resonate with conversations you've had, both on your side of the pond and globally. How do we advance that conversation and make it not just Groundhog Day all over again?
So I will be Jaya's evil soap opera twin.
Ah, yes, there we go.
So I mean, I agree with pretty much everything that Jaya's just said, right? I mean, I'm really glad that you like the principles, Jaya. I mean, what we tried to do was was put something out there that would move the conversation on, and it did for about a week. And we had some really good engagement with a whole broad section of people who have different views to us, and that's part of what's necessary. And then it kind of stopped. And we're 2 years on from that, and nothing's really changed. We're having the same conversation. The thing I'd say is, so I think we need to be honest about what we're talking about, and details really, really, really matter. So what you're trying to achieve as law enforcement or a government on something like WhatsApp is very different to something like Facebook, because the risks are different. And we need to be honest about that. We need to talk about what the risks are that we're trying to mitigate. And I don't think we should phrase this as a security versus privacy. This is security versus security, right? So you are talking about one of the key capabilities that governments around the world and law enforcement around the world use to mitigate terrorism, child sexual exploitation, and so on and so on and so on. What we end up with, which I think this is what we need to fix, is these very polarized views. And it's kind of the ghost protocol is evil and implementing it will kill the entire planet. All of your firstborn children will die if you implement the ghost protocol, versus if you don't do something, your children will die in the real world, right? Neither of those are true. So let's be really honest. The ghost protocol as it is known, the guts of it are pretty much how Facebook's secret messages work. So let's put that into perspective, right? And as far as I know, no evil government has ever broken and stolen those messages. The one thing that I think that really needs talking about is Jaya's point about why can't we use tailored access ops? So, right, we're a government. I'm from an evil SIGINT agency as well as a security agency. The things that we get told are the following two things. Number one, when you find a vulnerability, you must disclose it because leaving the vulnerability unpatched is evil and you put everybody at risk. Number two, we will not give you access to encrypted communications because you should use tailored access ops, which use vulnerabilities. I'm sorry to be blunt, but you can't have it both ways. There's a thing I've started saying, right? What we need in this is science, not sound bites. And I know it's a sound bite, but I make no apologies for it. We need to have a rational and competent discussion about the details of this stuff, rather than this 10,000 foot, chucking rocks at each other. But I mean, the positive thing is, I agree with a lot of what Jaya just said, and that's a positive, right? Let's start there and move on. I will now stop ranting.
Ian, I love that you made a soundbite of not making sound bites. That was brilliant. Also, you diffused one of my traps later. I don't know what I'm going to do now. I was going to play the vulnerability versus encryption fight, but it's an excellent point. So we'll come back to the vulnerability discussion later, and thank you for doing that, because I think it was needed. Jaya, and I think it's pronounced Jaya, right? I just want to make sure I'm doing it right.
Every variation of Jaya is good.
I'm going to follow up with another question for you before I move on to other people. And again, I think it's on the same subject. I've been working on a hypothesis recently that a lot of the privacy discussions that we have are heading in the same direction as this encryption fight. And I would open this up after you answered it to everyone as well. And a side note, folks, I'm told that you should use the Q&A tab, not the chat tab for questions. I'll look at that after. But Jaya, is the privacy discussion headed down that same slippery slope and going to wind up on the same episode of the same soap opera? Is it in fact leading to the same kind of discussion and the same discussion at its heart as encryption? Or do you think is there something unique about it, and is privacy something we should be highlighting differently?
Well, I think there's some process points that are the same. And I think it goes back to what Ian said. If we look at it only from a 10,000 foot view, we're not going to be able to separate the facts from the fiction. So, but to go back to what Ian said, just kind of to finish off that thing, I don't think that there's a blanket approach to any of it. Just like there's no single blanket approach to figuring out whether you need to have a secondary set of public key pair in order to have an additional participant to a conversation, which never gets notified to the primary participants. These are not easy things to construct. So I think that we should look at it on a case-by-case basis, which is pretty much what we mean when we say exceptional access. So it's not about you can never use a 0 day or you can never buy a 0 day, because let's be honest, we have a 0 day market out there. It's a black market and a white market, and where, a lot of governments also in Europe are trying to create a more legitimized market in order to buy these 0 days. No one ever said that they will not exist. No one ever said we're going to build perfect software and hardware. Although we try to, there will always be this potential to use them. The governments will stockpile them, etc. The only thing that I ask, and people who are in similar positions ask, is be nice to your fellow CISO, especially those in critical infrastructure, and give us a heads up before you go all YOLO and do your tailored access operations for the target you're trying to compromise, because that one target could actually compromise the rest of us. So really just a special heads up for your critical infrastructure. Yes, you're gonna do tailored access operations using ODay, fine, but then make sure that we understand what your vulnerability equities process is and that it's consistent and has oversight. So if we can do that, we're good on this thing, you know? So yeah, okay. And then for privacy, like, let's look at Schrems 2 for a second. I'm really worried that we sometimes bite off more than we can chew. The initial thoughts behind GDPR, really great. But then when you saw that how it actually manifested into, for example, internet registrars not being able to hold who is information, that's just crazy sauce. Okay, that was never the intention. So I think we really need to think on a really factual basis what it is we're trying to achieve before we fundamentally land, you know, cloud access from American companies because, gosh, GDPR and Schrems 2. So we really need to rethink what are those specific things that we need to engineer, and that will be, again, cryptography and with keys held in Europe or something like that, when we want to actually look at how we preserve privacy and security for everyone. I hope that answers that.
That did. I love that. So I'm going to take the bait and switch to the vulnerability conversation because it sort of came up now. But I do have to say, we have a question in the chat. How do we sign up for the Monster Raving Cyber Party from Jen Ellis? And I'm going to say that everyone should contact Jen Ellis for that, just on principle. And we'll coordinate through her. Sorry, Jen, but you asked the question. All right, so let's go to you, Suzette, if that's okay. On the vulnerability front, I saw you nodding vigorously when I mentioned the subject earlier, and I think I saw some other people nodding as well. Why are the basics still so hard to achieve on the vulnerability disclosure front and around responsibility disclosure of vulnerabilities? Why is this such a challenge still?
Sam, let's start at the very beginning. You have to you have to admit there's a gap somewhere, and especially when it comes to government and the myriad of what we're looking for, that's difficult. I know and I was glad to join and see my good friend Grant Schneider talking to the group before we started. Getting a vulnerability disclosure program out was one of the things that we worked really hard on inside the federal government, because just the reporting and the investigation, understanding not just how you action, but how you confirm what has happened and how you share that information is really, really tricky. It got back to, I was nodding vigorously at the conversation between Jaya and Ian, because the one soundbite that I will keep or pull out and had to reiterate over and over is the details matter. They matter a lot. When we're talking up at 10,000 feet, we're not making any progress. To Ian's point, that's why it kind of sat. And then Jaya made a really important point too. What does the oversight look like? So, at least on the side when we were looking at some of the vulnerability, kind of how does this process work? Getting to a process that people trust and are willing to participate in was a complicated set of activities, but how you action that, continue the communication, and what that looks like in operations across a very complicated organization, took a lot of debate. And the only way that we actually made progress and got to something people agreed on was getting down to those details in very specific scenarios. There's still a lot to solve. It's not perfect, but there's enough of a working infrastructure that you can actually advance the ball. And for every one of the people who are listening here today, it's incumbent on all of us to not let those conversations happen at the 100,000 feet level. Drive them down to something we can solve for, if we're going to continue to advance.
Yeah, that makes, the devil's in the details may be one of the most important points in security, actually. And your point about oversight, and I think you actually you understated the case for the environment you're responsible for. It might be one of the most complex, if not the most complex, out there. I'm going to come back to you, Ian, and then I'll maybe come to Wendy and see how she handles this from her various perspectives, both state and private sector stuff. But Ian, you touched on it earlier. Registered vulnerabilities with the government? Question mark. For years, skeptics, of course, raised eyebrows at this. You've been right in the center of it, and you've been very loud about it and very clear, helping to make it visible. Maybe you could discuss a bit how you've overcome some of these sort of traditional issues with ensuring the community can have its right defense and avoid fears and theories of weaponization. How far along that trajectory are we? What can we do to have our cake and eat it too here, or is that naive?
So I think, again, we've got to be really clear what we're talking about. So vulnerabilities in what? Disclosed by whom to whom? And so if you take UK government, so we set up a vulnerability disclosure process for UK government services. So there's the security researchers who are having real trouble. They'd find a vulnerability in a UK government service, they'd have real trouble actually reporting it to somebody responsible. And that makes you look like a bunch of muppets, because you're acting like a bunch of muppets. Even when they did find someone, sometimes the response would be, here's my lawyer, at which point you've kind of lost the right to speak. So we spent a lot of time getting the UK government behind a single vulnerability disclosure process, which we've run. We are responsible. We ask for researchers to be responsible. We thank them. We're nice to them. We don't threaten to sue them. And that sets a tone that you actually understand the people you're talking to and what drives them. We are assert, so we are, people do tell us vulnerabilities in order for us to manage them out into the real world. And we do that responsibly. We don't set arbitrary time limits. So we won't say, you've got 30 days or 90 days or 7 days. We work with the vendor to make sure that it can be patched properly, because, again, details matter. If you've got something that's out on ships floating around in the sea, you can't patch that in 30 days, right? If you've got a maritime vulnerability, it's totally different to something on an iPhone, which gets pushed quickly. So again, we try and work with people to show that we understand what they're doing. And then the third bit is when we discover vulnerabilities. So when the UK government, in all of its glory, that's the wrong word, surely, but the UK intelligence community specifically discovers a vulnerability, what do? What's the process we go through? How do we evaluate what we're doing? Well, the best way to tell people about that is to publish it. And again, evil SIGINT agencies, so why the hell would you trust us? Well, we ask an independent judicial commissioner to check we're following our process. And that's published. So they publish a public report every year that says, hey, the UK intelligence community did sensible things. The interesting thing, and people give this different value, right, is that process is chaired by NCSC. So the process is run by NCSC. So the security part, it has a presumption of release, and there has to be a good case made for retention. So trying to build understanding with the community, trying to be transparent about how you operate and being responsible, and then having somebody who doesn't like you very much check that you're following your process seems to be a sensible set of things to do. I can't say we've got it perfect, by the way. No way have we got it perfect, but we're trying to set a standard for how we operate, and we'd hope others would operate in the same way.
Yeah, it's always difficult to answer the question, who watches the watchers, right? But the fact that you have independent arms doing this, and you have process, and you have accountability, and you have a cycle that you follow, builds trust. It's never absolute, but it seems to be part of the answer, right?
Yeah, and we are credited with vulnerabilities with report. So there was one in Defender last year, which was basically, it was 0-click and it gave you kernel on Windows. Right, from an intelligence agency point of view, you're going, woohoo! To Jaya's point, you're going, oh my, what am I going to do about this? And so we patched it. We earn tens of thousands of dollars every year in bug bounties, which get donated to engineering charities and the like. So again, it's being part of the community in an open way.
So Wendy, I haven't called on you, and I'm so sorry it's taken this long, because I know you're probably chomping to say some things. But given you've done some state government, and certainly in the private sector. Maybe you have a private sector perspective on some of this. Why is this subject still around? This notion of responsible disclosure and consumption in some ways. Are there some clear and present obstacles to that you can see?
Yeah, why is this still a thing?
Yeah.
Absolutely. From a consumption point of view, I mean, I've been on all sides. I've been the one who is trying to get a hold of a retailer and say, I really need to talk to your security department, and no, I can't tell you why, because this is not a secure channel, to trying to patch something in my own systems that took 6 weeks to turn around the code fix for, but took a year to deploy for various reasons. I have a whole talk about that. But then also now working for a vendor where we have to consider a lot of things that go into our own product disclosure process. And a lot of people on the outside don't understand that as we get more interconnected and we have more dependencies, it just gets even more complex. We have to consider, first of all, if we know about the vulnerability, can we figure out who's affected by it? Can we tell our customers whether they're affected by it or not? And sometimes that's hard. We don't want to go to them too early and go, yeah, we don't know. You might be affected, you might not. Trying to write things or create things so that they can help. We can help our customers figure out whether they're affected and how to fix it. Working with third parties who may have no idea that they're involved in this vulnerability, but we have to call them up and say, you know, that thing you're doing, that's great, but we're going to need you to not, at least for 90 days until we can get this other thing mitigated. You know, it turns into a very complicated thing. But I have to give, as long as we're giving out props, I got to give mad props to Alan Friedman at NTIA, who has been working on multi-party disclosure for years now with such patience and enthusiasm and verve. You know, it's people like him who are bringing people to the table and having the concrete discussions that we need to have.
Thank you, Wendy. You mentioned NTIA, so I'm going to raise a question Andy Purdy had, and I'll open it up to anybody who wants to answer. He said, what is your reaction to the software bill of materials effort led by Commerce, NTIA? What other steps could telecom equipment suppliers take to be more transparent? Does anybody want to take a first stab at that?
I'll go really quick. I just had a talk with Alan about that, just like thanks to Ari, actually. Ari set it up. About a software bill of materials. And actually, this is something that, you know, we've needed forever. I was telling him about when we first saw Heartbleed, and I was CISO of a telco, and we were running a VPN, and we genuinely, I'll omit the vendors' names, we were running a couple of VPNs for the country, you know, for everyone to kind of get on, and we couldn't figure out on which devices we could run, which didn't have an integration of SSL. So, you know, and they didn't know which libraries, and they didn't know across which products. And they were like, well, even if you didn't turn it on, you're still vulnerable. And we can't tell you because we have no idea where we integrated the library. And this is where it gets terrifying. And not just from the open source perspective, but for everything we've built, we kind of need to know what kind of ingredients are in there to know if it's gluten-free or not. And that's kind of what we need to do for security as well. So, yeah.
Yep. Love that. I'm going to mark that one as answered. And I want to answer one more question that David Hoffman raised. I think it's for you, Ian. He said, how is the Independent Judicial Commission funded and resourced on your side? And I think this has to do with sort of checks and balances and making sure that they're perhaps, you know, watching each other properly. He said, how's it insulated from political influence is the way he asked it. And I think that's for you, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, so I am not a lawyer, I'm a mathematician, so I will give you my best mathematician answer. As best as possible. So there's balance, right? The government has to fund the office that gives all the resources to the commissioners, the various commissioners around, to try and hold the government to account in various ways. The advantage of someone like IPCO is it is a senior judge who is, yes, very senior. Judges are known for holding the government to account in the UK. do it all the time. And I think, again, details matter. So what works in the UK may or may not work in the US or anywhere else. But we are confident in our legislation, and the oversight in the UK is probably the best in the world. But again, it's public. People can go read it, and they can make a judgment about whether what we're doing is sensible or not. We think it is.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to shift to the next and our third topic, this one around process automation. And Suzette, I'm going to ask you this one next. Look, I think to some degree, the biggest problem in security is a lack of alignment between business functions and security, right? That they don't seem to get along very well. Departments are almost cogs in a machine throughout any given organization, right? They perform functions. But each has a purpose, and once you've identified the machine, you can sort of tune it. And I think as a CIO at one point, you probably thought about, how do I tune the machine? How do I drive things to process? I think in some ways that's the nirvana. So getting cogs down and getting efficiency up. But to what degree does security mess that up? How does process automation go wrong because of security? Dr. No, we sometimes get called, right? And to what chance maybe is the reverse true? What are their lessons from the IT side and the rest of the business that could improve how we do security? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And in the process automation space, I've probably spent the last 20 years doing different components. And I like to look at it more as this ensuring that we have security built in the process is how we trust the automation. And I want to actually break it apart in two pieces. When we automate, something, we have a set of tools that we're using to do the automation, but we're also having to trust the data. And when you look at those two pieces together, there's security questions all over the place. I could trust what I built, but not trust the data that was fed into it, not trust the input that was coming in. I still get a bad outcome. I have to have both of those pieces. So the process automation is how not only we drive efficiency, but we pull out some of the more mundane activities, and we ensure that we are focusing our best and brightest human resources on the most important problems. They're also how we use more data. We bring bigger tranches of data into making better decisions. So when I look at the spectrum, and when I say automation, I look at the spectrum from really basic business intelligence and RPA all the way up to what we're doing with AI and machine learning, and ensuring that we have security both in our technical layers, whether that's the compute or the actual software we're using, as well as where the data is coming from, the integrity with which it is gathered, the devices on which it was gathered. It's a bigger question, and security has played a very important purpose in making people, in ensuring that people are asking the right questions when they're building the tools, because it's going to drive a better outcome because we trust the results that are achieved. And if we can't answer the security questions, then we're not going to have a reliable outcome, from whatever kind of automation it is. And what has been important is that we're all at the table together, because the first thing that happens when you automate something and people don't trust the outcome, they say two things. Where did the data come from? And what did you build? What is this? And that's not advancing the ball. That's not, helping in any regard. It's creating inefficiency and distrust. So I think there's more at stake now. And as we seek to become data-driven and we have a proliferation of devices that are connecting that, our security challenges are bigger. They're not just in what we're building. They're in every component of the spectrum of how we drive automation.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to ask you, Wendy, the next one, similarly on process automation, but what I asked Suzette was around how do we perhaps align and use automation and security? How do we make sure we don't get in the way of automation? And Suzette's answer was amazing. But like when you play mirror chess, right? If for those of you who played chess, predictability is exploitability in some ways. We have a second order chaos enemy here. To what degree can and must we use automation in security? And to what degree does it become a liability or maybe open up new avenues of attack as we get maybe manipulated in our automation. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my feelings are that for automation, there are 4 important things that you need. You need certainty, you need precision, you need commitment, and you need transparency. So for certainty for automation, you need to be really sure that you want this to be automated, that you're going to trust it, as Suzette was talking about, to do the thing that you want it to do. You need precision. You need to make sure that whatever automated outcomes are coming are not leaking out to a wider scope than you want. You want to automate this thing and only this thing. You want it to have only these effects. You want to have commitment, because you've got to be able to set up the automation and then go and let it run. Because if you have to keep coming back to tweak it, you're not really committed and it's not really automated. So that's not buying you much. And then transparency. Everybody needs to be able to understand what it's there for, what it's doing. If you put something in, what's going to happen to it? And that's part of the trust, the really critical trust that Suzette's talking about. You can't build, black box automation. So for all these reasons, this is why blockchain is not going to solve everything. Sorry, people. Because
everyone's cheering on you. Yeah.
Blockchain is great for some things if you have commitment and you never ever make mistakes and you never have to go back and tweak things. But as you were saying, Sam, we're against a dynamic opponent. And so there are things, there are a lot of great science fiction stories around what if we automate both sides and they just go and war off together. But I don't think that's ever going to happen. The best organizations that I've seen today deal with modules of detection processes. They figure out how to detect something. They figure out if they can automate that so that a human doesn't have to do it anymore. And then they put it on the pile and they leave it to run so that the humans can focus on the newer and more dynamic things. So you're doing bits of automation and building that up as a portfolio. But I don't think we're ever going to have one big Skynet or one big anything because we're just too error prone as a species.
Yeah, not only do I not want AI to do this job, it might not want to do it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
If we ever pass the Turing test, it might be very bored with our job. But Jaya, I have to ask you a little off the cuff. Have you seen that? I mean, I think I've seen the case where people. I'll give one example: ransomware. Right, the bad guys, the IT identifies ransomware, and it's get up quickly. So reimage that system, drop ransomware like a grenade, and the forensic data gets cleaned up. Have you seen other instances, Jaya, of seeing automation exploited or what have you as a CISO or even as a security vendor?
Well, I was thinking of domain generating algorithms. There is really a case for both criminals that use automation to further their purposes, and then that we also need to use automation because if you just have an explosion, and I'm thinking specifically, Wendy, for a second about your retail example. So I was once talking to the CISO of a very big, without saying the name, of a very big supermarket chain in the UK, Ian, and he was saying, I just can't keep up. There's nothing for me to do without looking to AI to try to figure out who is registering into the thing. What are the different domains that we're seeing? And so they really need to turn to automation to figure out a good solution. And I think with all of this stuff, there's 2 things that I struggle with in general today with our field. One is the speed of stuff and the volume. So, and that's why I do think, with all due respect, I do think there is going to be, never blame conspiracy when complete incompetence is at play. So maybe it won't work, right? But I do think there's going to be kind of like a Skynet effort. If I just take a look at the couple of thousand satellites that Elon is launching and all of the stuff that we're doing towards more and more centralization of companies, I do think there are efforts to try to get to some, grander scheme of controls or a few companies that have a larger share of the market space. So automation is inevitable, and so is control in this regard.
Let's hope things of that level and not as gloom and doom as Skynet or HAL 9000. So yeah, no, I'm with you. There's also one term that came to mind when Wendy was giving her main point. That's the notion of leaky abstraction in engineering. That whenever you make an abstraction layer, it hides complexity and it makes the users prone to error. And I certainly would add just, I think we should encourage people always understanding how it works under the hood. So while we can make it easier to learn, we should know the limitations of the system. And when you have to automate those higher functions, both of you talked about, the easily reproduced lower order functions can be more easily automated. But when you start to move up the stack, make sure you're still sampling what you're filtering out and still looking for the, and doing so in a non-predictable way. So, but without going down that rabbit hole, I'm going to shift to the second to last subject, which is diversity. And let's say, let's go with you, Wendy, to start with. Diversity comes in many forms, right? Gender, ethnic, neurodiversity, religious, linguistic, many, many more. We know it's the morally right thing to do. So my first question of two to you is, in your experience, how and why is it maybe competitive advantage? How does diversity help us do this cyber job better?
Oh, it's totally a competitive advantage because security has to be about usability. And, it used to be 30 years ago when we were all getting into this that, we all had the same background. We all knew the same things. We could say things were intuitively obvious because, we were all coming from the same place. That's not the case anymore. We write for everybody, for the world. And it is ridiculous for us to say, well, we're just going to teach them to think like us and then everything will be fine. If we train them louder and harder, they'll understand. How's that been working for us? It hasn't. So you absolutely have to have diversity of thought, of experience, of geography, of business, of everything. But I want to emphasize that subconsciously, we often set up diversity as an alternative to whatever it is we consider the default today. So I'm always of two minds about focusing on particular underrepresented groups, because it feels, as a woman, if I'm invited to a woman in security thing, I feel like they're saying, well, women in security as opposed to normal people in security, or whatever. So it is not it's a false dichotomy to say, if you are looking for diverse people, you must therefore not be looking for the best people. That's a very insidious prejudice that we have to wipe out. If you start out assuming that everybody is equally qualified, then why wouldn't you want a variety of people? If everybody's great, you'd say, I really want somebody from Asia Pacific because there's stuff we can learn from them. I really want, somebody who is trans because there are things that we're not going to think of. I want somebody who's neurodiverse. And it's not that we're picking them just because of that, but it's in addition to, it's making all of our resources better to spread them out, to make them more diverse. So the final thing that I want to soapbox about here is that one mistake that we make all the time is we give the diverse problem to the diverse people to solve. We say, okay, we want to get more women in security. You're a woman, we're going to give you this job. And that, first of all, I am not a specialist in recruiting and hiring. That's not what I do. But also that gives me two jobs, besides my day job, is trying to figure out how to solve this problem. So, at Cisco, one of our heads of diversity and inclusion made it very clear to me when I was talking to her about recruiting is, she was like, you got to do your own homework. I'm not doing your homework for you. If you don't know enough diverse people to pull into a pipeline, you better go find them, because I'm not just going to give you a list and let you figure it out. So solving the diversity problem definitely makes you more competitive because it makes security easier to use. You stop running into things that you never anticipated before. You have fewer users that are trying to go around what you're trying to impose on them, it can improve the quality of whatever you're doing in so many other ways besides just being the right thing to do. So diversity is not the alternative to what we're doing. Diversity is the next level up. It's making everything better. If you want to level up your organization, that's where you want to go.
So the other point, of course, that occurred while you were talking is that the opponent doesn't have any limitations on diversity, right? They have many walks of life to pull from, and they do. And how are we gonna match them until we can think like them, or maybe outthink them? I'm going to ask a question that's open to anyone in a moment, and I'll tell you what it is before I go to Ian. The question is the one that I was going to follow up with you, Wendy, but I'm going to open it to anyone who wants to answer it, which is, what are we not doing that we could be doing? And so think about that for a moment. Ian, you flagged me, you wanted to speak on this subject, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Sam. So I think the first thing to say is what Wendy said. Second thing is the fact that the gender diversity on this panel is surprising is an utterly depressing thing for me. So a couple of years ago, NCSC, we tried to make a policy decision that said we will not attend any conference to speak on a panel where the gender diversity is less than 50-50. And then we worked out we didn't go to any conferences, so we couldn't do that. And it sucks terribly in this sector. And I think everything that Wendy's just said, plus, we've got to work out what qualified means, right? So, I'm a mathematician and computer scientist. Does everybody have to be a mathematician and computer scientist? No. The main thing you need to be is a devious sod, right? You can teach all the other stuff.
And there's plenty of those around, yeah.
Devious sod, yeah, I'm a liberal arts devious sod. So,
My point.
There we go.
Yeah, and this is the whole point, is we're self-censoring down to people who think and look like us or have the same qualifications as us. So we should stop that for a start. Second thing is the pipeline, certainly in the UK, is terrible. So we've invested for the last few years on what's called the Cyber First program. This is to get kids interested in cybersecurity specifically, but STEM generally. And our flagship thing is the Cyber First Girls competition. And this is all about getting girls sort of 12, 13 years old interested in cybersecurity. If you look at most cybersecurity competitions, they capture the flag. Testosterone fueled, raw, I'm coming to get you. Cyber First Girls isn't, because we're trying to show 12, 13-year-old girls that there is a real career here for them. And that's going to take years to filter through. I think there's an actual operational imperative to fixing diversity. So yes, it is morally right. And yes, being a good human being, we should do all of these things. We failed. So let's try a different reason. So I think there's an operational imperative, which is, for example, take artificial intelligence. So Suzette was talking about this before, you've got this brilliant algorithm, you feed it crap, you get crap. Artificial intelligence is trained on training sets, and you have an implicit bias at the moment in the development teams that choose particular training sets. And we've seen public examples of this, where credit rating algorithms prefer men over women, where computer vision things will prefer to say that a black subject is holding a gun versus a white subject, those sorts of things. As you start to rely on AI more and more, the diversity of the team building it is going to be critical. Can you imagine the catastrophic area we end up in if you've got a computer vision system or an autonomous car that judges different races differently with probability of being a pedestrian crossing the road? That really wasn't very well put. You know what I mean, though. It's catastrophic operationally. And so we have to now fix it, because otherwise we're going to start killing people. I'm quite passionate about this, as you can possibly tell. I have a bully pulpit. Right? Might not be a massive one in the US space, but it's quite big in the UK. We're thinking about things like, when we approve products and services, if the company, even if the product is amazing, if the company doesn't have a published diversity and inclusion policy that it sticks to, you're not getting certified and you're not selling to the UK government. So I have no idea if my lawyers will ever let me do it, but those are the sorts of things we're looking at. I think collectively, we have to take a step up. We are not doing enough. We are virtue signaling until it comes out. but we're not actually doing things that are hard to try and fix this problem. And I will now shut up. Sorry for the rant.
No. You know, what you made me realize is if artificial intelligence, and I did a presentation at RSA conference on precisely these biases in AI systems outside of security, even for privacy. It's happening in our subconsciouses as well. Our intuitive computers are making these same decisions, and I'm not going to mansplain it to a panel that's 60% women, but for the audience, it is a serious thing when you give that job that's a step up to somebody who's slightly underqualified and not quite ready, but they're white and they telegraph, and they're male and they telegraph confidence, versus the woman or the black person who's slightly overqualified and is still not getting the shot. But I will get off that soapbox. And Suzette, let's hear from you, because you also flagged me that I know you're passionate about this. I didn't think that we're gonna throw out election security as a subject, because we can always talk about that some other time, and we'll go to a final round as an acceleration. But I want to hear your perspective on it.
Well, Sam, I'm going to lean this towards what are the things that we're not doing. I agree with everything that was said, and am equally as passionate. And those are the things that I am doing now as a citizen in my private time. But I'll start with, what are we not doing? We're not starting early enough. And when I say that, there's lots of programs that, like Ian mentioned, you know, Girls Who Code, opportunities through religious organizations, through underrepresented, you know, minority organizations, cities that are reaching out, because we have to make this an exciting area, an interesting field, but expose it to those who are learning through multiple pathways, traditional education, non-traditional education, and continuing education. And one of the big things that has also been important is think about who our emerging workforce is learning from. So look at the World Economic Forum, like forecast for jobs, right, in the next decade, next 2 decades. Whether it's specifically cybersecurity or working in a technical problem-solving environment, those are critical skills for where our world is going. And if we're not also educating our educators and putting the equipment that they need in the classrooms so that they can teach the students, and they can expose them, we're not creating that workforce. So, you know, I kept picking at this and asking all the same questions. Why am I the only one in the room that looks like me? Where are other, you know, people? Why don't we have the diversity of thought at the table to help us battle clearly someone who's coming at us with a diversity of thought? And we would get back to that pipeline question. And we need to not fight over the exact same pipeline. We need to build a bigger pipeline for all of us around the world. And so some of the things that Ian touched on, Wendy touched on, I'm sure Jaya could go into, we have to continue and we have to push it back as far as we can into educational pathways so that we have people who are interested and they're not scared to get into it at a later point in life. It's something that is part of their DNA and how they operate as they're going through their educational processes.
Yeah, and to add to that, I would also say that it's not just the case of people who need to be educated and people who need to learn and young people. We also need to broaden our definition of what cybersecurity skills are and what that talent is, because there are a lot of people who are already doing this work and are not getting the recognition that they need. Like the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, a DC-based organization. Those are all women who are working in national security today, and they're too busy doing their actual job to get up on stage as much as they should. But you know, we need to reach out to people who, you know, don't look anything like a hacker in a hoodie. I've hired a lot of people myself who were my personal assistants or who, you know, came from completely different backgrounds and just said, you know, you're smart enough. Let's just teach you what you need to know, and you can get working on this right away. So again, there's no one pipeline into security. There's no one right age. You know, we have to keep thinking bigger.
Yeah, you know, I sometimes get asked, how do I wind up doing what you do? And I say, don't do what I did. Not only did we not have a path then, and most of us were winging it, right? But it's a very different journey today. I think we have to do a lot more listening to the younger generations and how they're approaching this, and give more than chances than we do telling them, and spending more time coaching them. So we are pretty much out of time. So I threw out election security. I'm going to throw out the crystal ball question. I think it was worth it. I think this last bit we were all super passionate about, and I hope the audience appreciated that the energy there and what we believe in. Apologies to David P., who asked, is there anything our adversaries are doing in particular is causing problems, concerns, either in industry or government critical infrastructure? If you would like that answered, David P., please feel free to write to me personally. The organizers will give you my email address, and I will put that out to the panel here. And I have to thank the conference and Ari, who just popped back on to take over, and say thank you, folks, on behalf of all of us. I've super enjoyed the Luminary panel. Hopefully you found it illuminating, and I look forward to talking with all of you in the future. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you, Sam. Wow, what a great panel. Thanks, guys, so much for doing this. I hope that we can have you all back